Hi, everyone. I'm Veronica Theodoro, and this is the House of Lou podcast. I have a great interview coming up today with Riley Price, Executive Director of Missouri Preservation. It's probably no surprise to you that I'm a big fan of historic St. Louis architecture. So I'm excited to talk to Riley and learn all about what she's up to. Thanks to Catherine Felt of the Frank Lloyd Wright House in Ebsworth Park for the introduction. Later on the show, I'll be giving you a rundown of my most anticipated events for the second half of the summer, so don't miss out. This episode of House of Lou is sponsored by Augusta Winery. Last night, I attended a lecture at SLAM about the new exhibit, Spanish America. It's such a fascinating area of art and study, and hopefully, by the time this episode airs, you've had a chance to see the exhibit for yourself. I highly recommend it. Last weekend, we celebrated my mom's 80th birthday with a big party at the house. My brothers and their families came into town. We caught the Cards Pirates game at Busch Stadium, and we topped off the weekend with dinner at Trattoria Marcella on Watson. I ordered the rigatoni and shrimp, which was delicious, and a big shout out to my colleague Cheryl Bear of the dining team for her spot-on recommendation. So what else is going on? Let's see. Oh, we announced the panel of judges for the 2025 Architect and Designer Awards competition. We're doing this a little bit earlier this year because I think we can all use, the extra time to put together all the paperwork and photography that's, required for this competition. So I also wanted to announce the judges earlier as well to give you a chance to learn a little bit more about who would be reviewing your submissions. It's always a challenge to narrow down the committee because there's just so much talent out there. So I decided this year that the criteria would also include designers from cities across the United States and not an exclusive focus on the coasts. So here's the lineup for this year. Brittany Bromley is the first person I reached out to. Her firm is based in Bedford, New York, a suburb of New York City. I follow Brittany on Instagram, where she posts photos of her projects, including one right here in St. Louis, which looks absolutely stunning. I also think you'll love watching her series of Q&As on a range of topics like fashion and travel and shopping. Kelly Cadillac came to my attention through her stunning design work on Adderton House, a National Historic Landmark built in 1845 in Arrow Rock, Missouri. Kelly is also the designer and visionary behind the renaissance of the Henry Blosser House, built also in the 1800s. Former Missouri Governor Jay Nixon declared the house the most endangered residence in the state in 2014. Kelly's based in Kansas City, and she's the author of Historic Style, Honoring the Past with Design for Today. Next up is Austin-based designer Fern Santini. I could pore over images of Fern's work for hours on end. She has such a way with color and so much variety in her portfolio. Fern is also the designer behind jewelry designer Kendra Scott's home in Texas, which many of you may have seen on a video house tour on archdigest.com. I'll be sure to add a link to that tour to our show notes so that you can all take a look for yourself. Our fourth judge is Jess Weith of Weith Home. Jess's firm is based in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, and it's also where she runs her home decor shop. I got the chance to write about one of Jess's projects earlier this year for Country French magazine. Her background is in fashion, and it informs the way she weaves color and fabric and pattern into her interiors. I'm thrilled to be back in touch with Jess and sharing her vision and unique Atlantic coast style with all of you. So there you have it. If you have any questions about the entry process for ADA, the deadline, anything else, please be sure to be in touch. Submissions are open now until October 15th. We'll be right back. The heat is on. Break out your sundresses and sandals and head to Augusta Wine Country on Highway 94. Visit Augusta Winery for a real taste of terroir in America's first wine region. Sample award-winning wines and dance to live music on weekends. Cool down in the evening hours at Augusta Winery's Second Sip Saturday and Friday night live events featuring music, spirit and craft brew tastings, giveaways, and local vendors. For hours, directions, event details, and dates, visit AugustaWinery.com. See you this summer in Augusta Wine Country. And now, on to my interview with Riley. Welcome to the podcast, Riley. It's so nice to meet you and talk to you in person.
So happy to be here and offer what knowledge I have to share.
Well, you have a ton of knowledge about a topic that I really love, and I'm so interested and intrigued to learn more about from you. So you're the executive director of Missouri Preservation. Tell us a little bit about the organization.
So Missouri Preservation, our full legal name is the Missouri Alliance for Historic Preservation. Kind of a mouthful, so we do shorten it to Missouri Preservation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization with a statewide focus on historic preservation. So there are individual community organizations such as the Landmarks Association for St. Louis. Out in Kansas City, they have Historic Kansas City. Missouri Preservation, we focus on both those cities, but also all of the small communities around the state of Missouri. And we help with advocacy for historic properties. We help with education. And we also offer assistance where we can for people who are seeking information on how to do historic projects, how do they save a building, that sort of thing. So we are kind of an all-around grand central station of preservation for the state.
So people who are interested in historic preservation, if they come to you or to your organization, you're not necessarily providing funding, though.
Correct.
Okay.
That is the one thing we do not offer is funding. Unfortunately, we are too small of a nonprofit for that. And if I had $1 for every time someone came to me and said, I have an old house that needs help and I need money, I would not be a small, struggling nonprofit. And maybe I could give money to people for their projects. I do have a list on my website that I update frequently of funding opportunities. So a lot of folks will come to me and say, my front wall is crumbling. Is there, a contractor who can do this? And is there money that can help me with this? And I will point them to this list of resources. Sometimes there's not always something available for them. As is the way in preservation, there is this common misconception that I have an old house, I have an old building, there's money for me. Unfortunately, that's not always true, but there is kind of a broad list of grants out there that there's always some sort of niche you might be able to find. And something I don't want to get too much in depth with it, as I spoke with you earlier about the historic tax credit. That is our number one resource here in Missouri for most preservation needs. It's not directly money, it's a tax credit. So it's kind of like a reimbursement on your efforts.
And I did read, and I was surprised and delighted to read this, that Missouri actually has one of the top historic preservation tax credit programs in the country.
That is correct. We've been around, our state program has been around since the 90s. There is a federal program also that's been around since about the 70s, I believe. But Missouri was almost sort of a model that other states then used to build their own programs off of. So we're really proud of that fact. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is the national advocacy organization, so we're like the statewide version of the National Trust, they release a report every year that talks about the success of these programs. And Missouri will rank amongst, not all 50 states have a program, but probably about 40 or so. Missouri ranks in the top 5 usually on how many projects have been done. So Missouri we're blessed, and we're also doing a great job with preserving our historic buildings.
So tell me a little bit about the process of historic tax credits. Like why is that program so effective and how do homeowners benefit from it?
So the historic tax credit, the Missouri tax credit specifically, is a 25% tax credit, 25% of your qualified rehabilitation expenses. So I had someone email me the other day and said, I have to spend X amount of money to get this back right. And I'm like, well, not exactly. You have to do the rehabilitation the right way. So the Department of Economic Development manages the program, the financial side of it per se. And then the State Historic Preservation Office, which is, I like to call them my state counterpart, the government counterpart. They help you prepare your project. They make sure that everything that you're doing in your rehabilitation conforms to what we call the Secretary of Interior Standards for Historic Rehabilitation, which I could take another 10 years to talk about. But basically, they're just ensuring that you're keeping the historic character of your house.
Right.
And the things that you're doing are going to carry on the integrity. That's what in preservation, integrity is a very big word. It's making sure that you're keeping what really defines the historic character of the building. So they walk you through that process, and up to 25% of those expenses can then be returned to you in form of a tax credit. So it's a rigorous process. For the anti-tax credit people, I always tell them, there is this common misconception that a tax credit is free money, and people are just negative about it. And I always tell them, with the Missouri Historic Tax Credit, with the Federal Historic Tax Credit, they are putting all of the work into these properties. They are doing all of the rehab. They're hiring local jobs. They're using, they're investing in the local economy. They are getting audited, and they are making sure that their work is conforming to these standards. And all of that is approved and reviewed a million times before that tax credit is ever issued. So they're really,
It's a rigorous.
yeah, and they're giving back to the community. 100% it is, guaranteed that they are, not donating, but giving back to the community and helping the economy before they ever see any money. So I always say, not like any other tax credit. It's a good one. It's saving our buildings, but it's also helping our economy. So support it, please.
How does St. Louis fare in its percentage of historic tax credits? Like, do you see a lot of applications from this area?
St. Louis is rolling in tax credit projects. We're hoping to pass legislation. The governor has it to sign, hopefully soon. Legislation that will increase the tax credit outside of St. Louis and Kansas City to 35%, because St. Louis and Kansas City, but St. Louis even more so, are doing projects left and right.
Okay.
Which is
good.
Awesome. It's awesome. When I do advocacy work with our legislators at the Capitol, we like to print out lists and say, hey, these are projects that have already been done in your district. And the St. Louis projects, I stopped printing them because most of our senators and representatives from those areas realize how beneficial it has been for their communities.
Yeah, of course.
Especially, I would say the Tower Grove area, South City, left and right.
Really active, it sounds like.
It's turned around communities. It's really helped. And I know a lot of developers and architects who work on these projects will say that these projects weren't possible without the help of the tax credit.
Why do you think it's important to preserve older building residences? Why should people care about that?
I recently did a presentation the other day that I tried to narrow it down, the why of preservation. And let me tell you, I was racking my brain, because the why for everyone usually is different. Not everybody has the same why. And I tried to categorize it, narrow it down to help, because we all have, like I said, we all have our whys, but then it's hard to then explain to somebody else who is anti-preservation the why,
Right.
to get them on board, because that's most of the struggle in preservation, is convincing other people. And so I kind of narrowed it down to aesthetics, connections, sustainability, economic development, and education. Those are our overarching categories. And I will say that very much. This is probably the one that's the hardest to convince people, but aesthetics is 100% the reason I got into preservation, because I just think old buildings are pretty and they make me happy,
Right.
But sometimes that argument doesn't always come across with other people. So then we pull in, well, it's sustainable. We're reusing our materials that are already there. It's economic development. Like I said earlier, these tax credit projects and just preservation projects in general, you're, putting money into the local economy. Educationally, obviously, we have a lot of great historic sites here in St. Louis that are always having, school groups come in. They can teach us things
Right.
that being in a classroom setting might not necessarily get across this information to children. But when you immerse them in the space, suddenly like the light switch flips on and they can understand these topics. So there's a little bit, it's a little bit different for everyone. So like I said, I try to break it into these groups to better help convey the why. And there's a topic I'm trying to share more information about with the general public when it comes to preservation advocacy and advocating to save our historic buildings is called interpretation. If you go to a state park in Missouri and someone speaks to you about a building or about nature or something, they call that interpreting. So with interpretation, they want to convey the why and they want people to then be provoked to learn something more about it. So with preservation and interpretation, I'm trying to find the ways to connect to people who might not necessarily see the aesthetics of the old building.
What are some of the barriers to becoming a historic district?
So with historic districts in St. Louis, we are quite lucky in that we already have a lot established. A lot of those were put into place probably the 80s, the 90s. There was a lot of things getting listed. Nowadays, we have the concern that there isn't enough integrity per se with a historic building. And one of the things I hate about my job, I will say it out front, I hate it about my job is when someone contacts me and says, I have a historic building, is it listed? Because even though it's listing on the National Register, either individually or as a part of a historic district, it's honorary. And people who aren't listed want to be listed. It makes them feel good. And sometimes I have to say, well, even though your building is historic, it's old. There's no doubt about it. It's old. There's probably a story that you have that makes it important to you. There is a set of standards that the National Park Service, who kind of oversees the entirety of the National Register districts, there is kind of standards that they set forth. For a building to be listed, generally it has to be at least 50 years old.
Okay.
That doesn't always apply, especially in the district setting when you're listing multiple properties in a group. And the property has to have what they call integrity. And integrity is really, does this still have its original features or most of its original features? So a lot of times in a district, you might have what they call contributing and non-contributing resources, where you'll have a block, say your typical Main Street, like here in downtown Maplewood. You'll have probably 10 buildings in a row, and they're all their beautiful historic storefronts. And then there's one that has a god-awful siding, vinyl siding has been put up, the windows have been covered. That will probably be listed, if the whole street is listed in a district, that one building will probably be noted as non-contributing to the district, which then means it's not eligible for things like the tax credit. When something is not listed yet at all, and something Missouri Preservation is starting to look into is North St. Louis in particular. Right now, there are only 2 or 3 districts really north of that Del Mar area, the scary Del Mar divide of St. Louis. There are so many beautiful historic buildings.
Yes.
North St. Louis. In fact, St. Louis Avenue used to be known as Millionaire's Row. Like, the buildings up there are amazing, but a lot of them aren't listed in a district because they do not have, there's no cohesive connection between one building and the next. So North St. Louis suffers terribly from blight, we all know. So you'll have blocks at a time that have been demolished. So it's hard to create a district when you don't have a lot to, to piece it together. The districts that do exist in North St. Louis, a lot of them, I believe 2 of them at least, are specifically listed because they were designed by one architect and it's like a street. That is the reason they are grouped together. A grander part of the National Register for districts and for individual listings is the categories in which make them eligible. There's 4 of them, A, B, C, and D, and most often our districts are either A or C, or together A and C. So A is associated with a theme in history, it's associated with a big event, and C is it's associated with architecture. Either, it's a particular style, it was associated with a particular architect of note, or planning, it was a planned subdivision. So like in the Central West End, those big neighborhoods, the streets, the Washington Terrace, those are, listed because they are these planned neighborhoods, but also because the architecture.
Is there anything that your organization can do in these neighborhoods, like you talked about in North County, to create districts, or not? At this point, is that not possible?
Well, what we're looking at, there is a larger movement in the United States to look at how we are grading our historic buildings. Because, like I said, some people are like, I have a historic house. It's old. It's important, right? And it's so hard to tell them, well, it doesn't meet these standards. And there's this negative aspect towards preservation always that we're gatekeepers. And that's not true. Not in our hearts, it's not really the sense. Maybe on at that academic level, there is some gatekeeping, and we're trying to change that. And something that we're looking at is trying to figure out a way to maybe grade our historic buildings, because in England, there's obviously a plethora of historic resources, and they have a grading system. They grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. So when you see their buildings, maybe a palace like Balmoral Palace in Scotland, that's a grade 1 listed heritage site. And then maybe your downtown, just a little business on the street, that's a grade 3. They're both historic. They both might benefit from a resource, but they're not being scrutinized
in the same
way. We're hoping, this movement might be able to change how we look at places like North St. Louis. These buildings are no less important. They are deserving of preservation, of recognition. And maybe, we don't come in here and look at it with such a fine-tooth comb, because it's not their fault that they are in their situation.
Right.
It's not their fault that, half the block was bulldozed. We should not take that out on that historic structure. That shouldn't mean that it doesn't get documented or it doesn't benefit from the tax credit and other resources that are available because they are listed on the National Register as a district or as an individual listing.
As an executive director of this organization, what's top on the list of your priorities?
Right now, we are really working to raise awareness of Missouri preservation as an organization in general, because a lot of folks don't realize we exist. They don't realize that preservation and rehabilitation of our historic properties is really a feasible option. So being on podcasts like this, we're trying to preach the good word of preservation and the existence of Missouri preservation, and that we're here to help you where we can. Like I said earlier, we don't have the funding resources to give you money for your projects, but I have lists on my website that say, these are funding resources that you can look into. I have a preservation resource directory where folks can come in and find, I need a carpenter, or I need a contractor that's preservation minded, that kind of knows how this stuff works. So you can look them up in that directory. I always compare it to the Grand Central Station. Hi, I have a question. What do I do? Where do I go? And I try to put it on my website, just spreading the word, making everyone aware that there are resources available. We are here to do what we can.
It was really interesting that you personally are available to give workshops or talks on issues surrounding preservation, really to really anyone, right, who calls
Correct.
you with this particular need.
I have a few presentations on standby that if they call and they're interested, Historic Tax Credit 101, just, learning about the program and how that works. Our Secretary of the Interior standards, that's a big mouthful, and there's kind of a in-depth that goes with that. I will talk on that. Recently, I said the why of preservation. That's the newest thing that I'm really trying to get across to everyone, is that why. So all they have to do is contact me, reach out and say, hey, I would love for you to come speak to my community group about this. I'm more than happy to come and spread the word,
And
educate.
we'll be sure to include your email address in the show notes. But I also read that you are in the process of organizing your annual conference.
Correct.
Tell us a little bit about that and who's invited, who gets to go, and what are some of the agenda items?
One of our biggest things we do at Missouri Preservation is our annual conference. It is a huge networking event. We travel to a different city around the state every year. This year, we are going to be down in Eminence, Missouri, actually at Echo Bluff State Park. So this year is going to be different than any year we've had before. But we bring together preservationists from all across the state, either, local community commissioners that work on Historic Preservation Commission. We've got architects, developers. It's kind of a big old soup pot of all the different people who are involved in the field, and we get together and it's just a bunch of nerds getting together to geek out about preservation, get updated on what's going on in the field, what everyone else is doing. We generally host with this conference. We usually do a window workshop.
Oh, cool.
This year, I'm excited. Instead of wood windows, we are doing steel windows, which is something new. We have some steel window specialists coming in to talk. Members from the State Historic Preservation Office will be coming in to talk about the services that they offer and the programs that they run through the state. So we're always excited to get updates from them on how things are working. As the official legal entity in the state, it's always good to know what page they are on and what we need to be doing to, keep up with the standards. But really, it's just a feel good, everybody get together and have a good time and celebrate what we've been doing throughout the year and coming and taking ideas home to communities. That's my favorite thing to do is these folks who come in and they're not a professional. They are just interested in preservation and they're serving on their commission and they want to come get information and take it back to their community about this is what we can do. This is what, maybe Carthage, Missouri is doing this. So we should take this down to our town and see how it works with us.
If you could recommend a town or a city in Missouri that you think is perhaps overlooked in terms of like preservation tourism, right? Outside of Kansas City, obviously, and St. Louis, what would you recommend?
There's a lot of them, but one that I wasn't on board with until I went to it myself, St. Joseph, Missouri. It's kind of Kansas City, but not. It is the most, I don't even know how to put it into words. I almost crashed my car when I drove through the town because I was too busy looking at the amount of historic resources that they have within such a small square mileage area. The amount of historic homes that they have that are just waiting for somebody to come in and rehab them. It's just phenomenal. And the town itself, so many people who live there don't realize what they have. We took our conference there in 2019, and it was so funny to see locals who weren't involved in the preservation field going, why are these people so excited to be here? What is going on? Why are they so interested? And it's great to be able to bring that to these communities. And that's part of why I love our conference is being able to bring this group of nerdy preservationists and architecture lovers to these different communities who might not realize what they have.
Yeah. Well, you've definitely piqued my interest. Riley, a little bit about your background. I'm sort of interested to know, how does someone grow up to be someone who gets a position as a leader in preservation? What was your trajectory?
I was a historic little nerdy kid from the very, very beginning. And I like to say that I blame it on my grandparents and my mom, especially. My grandparents traveled a lot. So they always would bring back these coffee table books, the big heavy tomes. They went to England and specifically, I remember Hearst Castle out in California. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And my favorite that I always looked at, something on Imperial Russia, the palaces of Imperial Russia. And I would just look through those as a kid. I just loved them. Looking at all the pictures of the interiors and just all of the details. It was gaudy. And I do love gaudy architecture. And then my mom, when we would, I grew up outside of the city out in Jefferson County. So, there's not a lot going on out there. But anytime we came into the city to go see a show at the Fox or go to a baseball game, my mom would make sure we would take time to drive through neighborhoods like Compton and Tower Grove, and we just drive along and look at the houses. And that's me at like 7 years old, looking out the window, just as excited as my mom to see these beautiful houses. There's just something about them. So it was inevitable that I would end up in history in some sense. But it wasn't until I reached high school that, you start looking into colleges and what can I do? And everybody's a history teacher if you're in history. And I was like, I'm not going to be a teacher. I'm going to find something else. And I discovered that Southeast Missouri State University had a historic preservation program, and I was sold. That's exactly what I'm going to do. This is my dream job. Let's go. And I have to brag on my program. It is, I will always say, one of the best in the country, not just because of, what we learn, but the people we meet. There are alumni from the program all across the country that, we have connections and people. You have to do an internship when you're in this program. You have to go work at a historic site or a museum or whatever your niche interest is. And when I was in the program, actually worked at the conference. The Missouri Preservation Conference in 2015 was in Cape Girardeau at SEMO, and I volunteered and kind of made this connection with board members of Missouri Preservation. And then a few years later, they needed somebody to be an administrator, and I was
right there,
ready and waiting to take a job right out of college, and I took it, and here I am.
How many members are in the organization?
Right now, we only have about 250.
Okay.
So
you're working on
as
building
a statewide, we want to rebuild that because, there's a lot of people out there, and a bulk of our membership is actually here in St. Louis, which is great. But as a statewide organization, we want people from all over.
Why do you think preservation efforts have been so successful in St. Louis in particular? Is it something about the city? Is it the residents? Is it the architecture that just calls to all of us to preserve it? What do you think where's the magic?
I think it's a little bit of everything. You say, the architecture, people do not realize what we have here in St. Louis. I have folks that will come in from other states that come to St. Louis and are like, oh my gosh, you guys have so many amazing brick house, like the brick. St. Louis brick is something that folks don't realize that we had a very, in Dogtown had, brick manufacturing. And so a lot of St. Louis brick buildings, you don't have that concentration of brick buildings in other cities. So that's just an amazing tidbit in itself. But I think St. Louis, we always get a bad rap, the crime, the violence, and no. Ignore that because we are such a family city. I feel everyone is the community, the community mindedness of it all. We love our story. We love sharing our story. And that all ties in with preservation because, saving our buildings is saving these stories for the future to share. And I think that mentality, we're just all, if you're from the Lou, you're from the Lou and you're going to preach prod. And I think that it really does tie in with the preservation of what we have. And all comes together that way.
A great connection. Well, Riley, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm so happy to be here, and I encourage everyone to check out our website, preservemo.org. I have resources aplenty if you have questions about preservation. If you can't find it there, you can email me, and I will add it for everyone else to find in the future.
So you heard it here. You can email Riley for information. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now on to V's Views. If you love sweets like I do, then you're in luck. On July 18th, tune into stories about St. Louis's candy history from food historian Suzanne Corbett and Patrick Murphy, author of Candyman, the story of Switzer's licorice, at the Missouri History Museum. The whole family is invited to enjoy hands-on activities, demonstrations, and yes, plenty of samples. For those of you who aren't familiar with the National Building Arts Center in Sauget, an upcoming event with architect and photographer Gary Tetley might give you the perfect reason to take a drive out there. On August 14th from 6:30 to 8, Tetley will revisit an exhibit of his early work that focused on his photos of buildings in downtown St. Louis, many of them from the turn of the century and the subject of salvage operations led by Larry Giles, MBAC founder. And don't forget to sign up for Missouri Preservation Conference, September 25th through the 27th in Eminence, Missouri. Registration is open now. And as Riley mentioned in our interview, she's also available to book for workshops or lectures at your own community organizations or for a group of friends who are interested in the topic of preservation. Thanks for listening to the House of Lou podcast. Our episodes drop on the first Wednesday of every month. Be sure to follow us and share the episodes with your friends. Be in touch. Subscribe to our design and home newsletter at stlmag.com/newsletters and follow along on Instagram at St. Louis Mag. You can follow me at VT Lookbook. If you loved what you heard, show us some love by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you choose to listen. We'll see you next time. And just remember, there's so much to see in St. Louis if you know where to look.